Hello, and welcome to Module 2 of our API training series. This module will be describing a lot of concepts around the API, the technologies which underlie it, and how we can use those to actually get things done in more of a sort of a general sense. So we'll be describing data access, we'll be describing the methods that REST actually supports, and as well we'll be illustrating very briefly some of the general concepts that you need to understand in order to get the best out of this series of trainings. And finally we'll be going through some exercises, the solutions to which are covered in separate recordings, and as well there is some homework for you to complete. REST is an industry standard mechanism for writing web services, and a web service is generally something that passes XML between one system and another. So whenever we're using the API, you'll see that we're passing XML about. So you should be familiar with XML. And the transport mechanism which is used to pass that XML about is provided by HTTP. So you're familiar with that from just using your standard internet or web browsers, and it's the same thing here. We can use HTTP to send and retrieve XML. So that's neat because some of the operations we want to do we can actually test out or play with in advance just using a web browser. So that's great for getting information. If we want to put information back, then we need to use a web browser plugin such as Poster. So if you're using Google's Chrome browser, there's a version of this called XHR Poster, and there is the link, although you should be able to go into the App Store and find it. And similarly, if you're using Firefox, then we've had a lot of customers tell us that they like the Poster plugin, so that's one that we recommend. So it's definitely worth installing the browser plugins, at least when you're sort of starting off and exploring. And when it comes to exploring, you can go about getting the information you need a number of ways. You could just use the browser and start digging and see what you can find. But a much more time efficient way is to actually open the developer.genealogics.com website, which is a community website which describes the reference material and working examples to get you started and to have you using the API as quickly and as productively as possible. So here is the website, and one of the things that you might find useful, at least at first, is the resource map. And this shows the relationships between the major business entities that you'll be using when you're manipulating the LIMS via the API. So we can see, for example, the relationships involved in samples and projects, and as well we see how things are connected via processors, etc. So it might be worth actually printing out this REST resource map, at least in the early days, until you see how these things, or you have an intimate knowledge of how these things are related. Regardless of what you're using to interact with the API using the REST methodology, there are really only 4 basic operations you can carry out, and we've got these listed here. So if you want to create new information, so you want to create a new sample or submit a new project to the LIMS, you can do that using the REST method, which is called POST. Notice these are all uppercase when you're actually using these in code. If you want to retrieve or read information, then the REST method you would use would be GET. The next one on our list is PUT, which is update. So this is slightly different to POST. POST is creating new information. PUT is used when you want to send back information that you've modified or edited. So GET and PUT go hand in hand in that an edit operation is made up firstly of a GET, then you modify the XML, and then you would put it back to update the resource. And then finally, the one which is potentially dangerous and therefore we don't support it in too many places throughout the API is the delete, which obviously allows you to remove resources that you no longer require. We're assuming that you're already familiar with the LIMS, and as such there are a number of general concepts that you should be familiar with. The first of which is authenticating. So in order to use the API, you're going to need a username and password, and we're anticipating that you've already logged into the LIMS via either the operations interface or the lab scientist interface, or possibly both. You should also be familiar with the general response codes and errors that the HTTP protocol can respond back to your requests with, and it's a good idea to also be familiar with the character encoding that is required by XML. Also, the API has a number of versions, so it's good to know how to make sure you're using the correct version. And then there's also how to navigate list resources when they are paginated. So the analogy here is that when you do a search using an internet search engine, chances are you're going to get more than one page of results, and it's up to you to manually page or navigate through the pages. And it's the same when you request a list of information that is too large to fit on a single page. Now, an alternate to that is, rather than requesting an entire list of information, is actually being able to specify in your query a subset of the items that you want to list. So we class that as filtering list resources. So that's something else that is going to be required, probably when your system starts to fill up with production data. Also, other things you should be aware of is how the LIMS uses user-defined fields, UDFs, and user-defined types, UDTs. So we're expecting that you already know what they are and how to use those, because it's generally something that the API requires you to manipulate, or not requires, but the problems that people are trying to solve often involve these UDFs and UDTs. You should also be familiar with what a genealogy is within the operations interface. That's quite useful when you're starting out, to be able to see the types of artifacts that have been generated, and as well as an understanding of artifacts, also which ones are supported, which ones aren't, and similarly with process. And then the last one on the list here is working with batch resources. So it might not be something that you need to worry about at first, but as you get deeper into this, you may find yourself you've written a script that works perfectly, but it runs quite slowly because it's getting each resource one at a time. So if it processes 96 samples on a plate, it gets each of the artifacts individually, edits them, and puts them back individually. And that creates a certain amount of overhead that can be reduced by working with batch resources. So under batch resources, the interaction would be to retrieve all of the artifacts that you want in a single transaction, edit them, and then update them, or rather update the LIMS with them, all in a single transaction. So rather than having 96 get operations followed by 96 put operations, there's a single get that retrieves all 96 and a single put that updates all 96. Chances are the best way to understand these concepts is to actually apply them. So we've outlined here some exercises, the solutions to which are covered, as I've mentioned earlier, in separate recordings, but the goal of these is to understand how things can be found in the operations interface, and then correspondingly to locate those using the API. And we won't be writing programs or scripts to do this, we'll just be using your web browser. So we'll be looking at samples, analytes, result files, and processes. Then we'll use the API via one of the browser plugins to perform a simple edit. So exercise 2 is firstly a get, followed by a put. And then in exercise 3, once again using one of the browser plugins, we will find the container in the operations interface, we'll perform a get on the API, modify the XML, and then use that XML to create a new container using the post method. And then there's some homework for you to complete offline, and that homework is to go to developer.genealogics.com and to review the exercises and some of the recipe examples that you can find under the cookbook resource.